Welcome to just a quick overview of the second portion of the reading assigned for Beowulf 1251 through 2509. In this portion of the text, a number of things happen. Among them, Beowulf fights Grendel's mother. When the first time I didn't read it, I wasn't imagining Angelina Jolie. I'm going to level with you. But I wouldn't depend on the film Beowulf with is it Gerard Butler? I can't remember, but Jolie Wolf, as we call it in the biz. I wouldn't depend on that as a reliable guide to what happens in the poem. There are some significant differences. Moving right along. So let's talk a bit about the second part of Beowulf. Then here's some key passages. Grendel's mother attacks, beginning in line 1251 to 1295. And this is in keeping with a pattern of reciprocity in heroic literature of the Scandinavian, early Anglo-Saxon world. Somebody killed somebody in your clan, you killed somebody in their clan in return, generally. There was early on in Germanic culture a custom called the weregild, whereby if somebody in your clan killed somebody in mine, then you could compensate my clan by paying a certain amount of gold. Weregild, it was called. And the were here comes from an old English word, were, meaning man, related to the Latin vir, I guess virile. And that wir also comes into modern English in the very specific word werewolf, which means, in fact, man-wolf. Who knew? Anyway, Grendel's mother attacks, and we learned that, she had been forced down into fearful waters. This is line 1260. The cold depths, after Cain had killed his father's son, felled his own brother with a sword. Branded an outlaw, marked by having murdered, he moved into the wilds, shunned company and joy. And from Cain there sprang misbegotten spirits, among them Grendel, the banished and accursed, due to come to grips with that watcher in Hilrot waiting to do battle. Now, I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a subsequent video I will make on the tension between Christianity and paganism in Beowulf. But it's interesting here. This is an example of how Christian legend gets synthesized into Germanic legend in this text. At 1345 to 1361, we get a description of Grendel's mother from some dude who's just hanging out there in Herod. He's like, oh yeah, I've heard it said by my people in Hall, counselors who live in the upland country, that they have seen two such creatures prowling the moors, huge marauders from some other world. I love this. It's like, why didn't they say so before? Anyway, they dwell apart among wolves on the hills, on windswept crags and treacherous caches where cold streams pour down the mountains and disappear under mist and moorland. Sounds enticing. Let's see. In lines 1384 to 1396, we get Beowulf's heroic speech, and I spoke about this at the end of the video on oral formulaic poetry as being an example of as example of gnomic statements. So let's move on from there. In 1442 to 1462, we get something that is that appears in heroic literature throughout the ages. What you just saw is a modern-day instance, and a parody, in fact, of the lock and load montage, a staple of action movies for decades, and a modern version of what has been a staple of all kinds of narrative forms that celebrate heroic, warlike masculinity, going all the way back to Homer. Achilles and other heroes in the Trojan War. He describes in loving detail the and putting on his greaves and his breastplate and his shiny spear and his big helmet. We see it in chivalric romance in the later Middle Ages. We'll see it in, for instance, we'll see it in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, when Sir Gawain is going to put on his armor to get going. So yeah, we see it here in Beowulf too. It's just a staple of, there's these weird recurring things that are called that are just staples of literature, that are used time and time again. In medieval studies in particular, we have a name for these, and that's the topos singular, or topoi plural. And this is the arming topos that you just saw, and that we can see here from lines 1442 on in Beowulf. Now, one of the items that he arms himself with, of course, is this sword Hrunting, which Unferth gives to him. And Hrunting talks about how great it is, and Beowulf says, with Hrunting I shall gain glory or die. And notice, actually, one pattern here, that Beowulf has gone from fighting unarmed, now he's fighting armed. And this is just a sort of indicator of how each fight gets harder and more challenging for Beowulf, and less of a chance to sort of prove his glory. A couple things about the sword. One is that it's described as keen, inlaid, worm-loop patterned steel. And I just wanted to show you that this was a real sort of thing in Anglo-Saxon. You can see that pattern there. And when they were making the steel, they would fold it over and braid the hot iron and then beat it flat again. And this had the way of making the metal stronger and harder to break. This is sometimes called Damascene steel. So just a little bit of material culture for all you nerds who are really into like material culture of the past. Of course, the other thing to remember about Hrunting is that it fails, it melts, and why is that? It's a really interesting thing. Well, one of the weird sort of pagan early Germanic things that is perhaps present in Beowulf is this idea of that we find in Old Norse literature of that warriors who were buried in the barrows, in the burial mounds, that had been sites of worship for pre-Christian Scandinavians. When the Christians came, they said, "Oh no, that's where cursed souls live, and you have to stay away from them, from those barrows, because who lives in there? Well, the Old Norse word is Draugr, and in early text, Draugr just meant warrior, but later on, Draugr comes to mean sort of like undead, pre-Christian monster men who will come and hurt you. This is of course from the game Skyrim, which riffs on a lot of Anglo-Saxon and Nordic folklore. Anyway, back to serious stuff. Hrunting fails because one of the things that attaches to the myth or the legend of the Draugr is that they can only be killed with their own weapons. And so we find that Beowulf sees a blade at line 1557, a sword from her armory, an ancient heirloom from the days of the giants, and this is the weapon that he uses to kill her. But this weapon, it can't be brought back to the human world after he kills her. It begins to wilt into gory icicles, we're told, at 1606, to slather and thaw. It was a wonderful thing the way it all melted, as ice melts when the father eases the fetters off the frost. Nice alliteration there. And unravels the water ropes. He who wields power over time and tide. He is the true lord. Oh, yes. So Beowulf gains an item, but he doesn't get to keep it. And then he comes back to Heorot, where he gives a speech recounting his exploits, and it's going to be party time again. This time Beowulf has actually solved Heorot's monster problem, and everyone in Heorot will live happily ever after. That's not true, actually. There's going to be a blood feud, and Heorot's going to burn down. But that's a story for another day. From lines 1700 to 1785 is a famous part of this poem sometimes called Hrothgar's Sermon, in which the elderly king Hrothgar both congratulates Beowulf for his strength and then gives him a few life lessons. And I'm going to come back to that in a video where I talk about the way this poem negotiates Christian versus the heroic pagan, if you will, ethos. So we're going to loop back to that. In the meantime, let's just talk about a few more key passages. Beowulf sails back to his home in Geatland, having successfully triumphed, and reports back to Higelac, where he will recount his story and everything that he did. In doing so, he sort of says a few things that he politically wisely didn't say when he was among the Danes, and he talks about how looking at from about 2009, line 2009, when I first landed, I hastened to the ring hall and saluted Hrothgar. Once he discovered why I had come, the son of Halfdame sent me immediately to sit with his own sons on the bench. It was a happy gathering. In my whole life I have never seen mead enjoyed more in any hall on earth. Sometimes the queen herself appeared. Peace pledge between nations. To hearten the young ones and hand out a torque to a warrior, then take her place. The peace pledge here alludes to that idea I spoke in the previous video about the woman as an exchange to seal peace, the so-called peace weaver. I heard the company call her Freya Waro as she made her rounds, presenting men with the gem-studded bowl, young bride-to-be to the gracious Ingeld. In her gold-trimmed attire, the friend of the Shieldings favors her betrothal. The guardian of the kingdom sees good in it, and hopes this woman will heal old wounds and grievous feuds. No mixed statement time, but generally the spear is prompt to retaliate when a prince is killed, no matter how admirable the bride may be. Think how the Heathobards are bound to feel, their lord Ingeld and his royal thanes, when he walks in with that woman to the feast. Danes are at the table, being entertained. Honored guests in glittering regalia, burnished ring-mail that was their host's birthright, looted when the Heathobards could no longer wield their weapons in the shield clash, when they went down with their beloved comrades and forfeited their lives. Generally the spear is prompt to retaliate when a prince is killed, no matter how admirable the bride may be. Beowulf is criticizing the whole custom of peace weaving and saying, no, this doesn't work. This is not a way to solve our problems. And it's one of a number of places in which this poem seems to be implicitly critiquing a lot of the central institutions and customs of the world to which it belongs and which it reflects. We get this little sort of hypothetical situation where Beowulf imagines an old spearman will speak while they are drinking. This is at line 2041. Why don't you open up your text and follow along yourself? An old spearman will speak while they are drinking, having glimpsed some heirloom that brings alive memories of the massacre. His mood will darken, and, heart-stricken, in the stress of his emotion, he will begin to test a young man's temper and stir up trouble, starting like this. Now, my friend, don't you recognize your father's sword? His favorite weapon, the one he wore when he went out in his war mask to face the Danes on that final day? After Withergeld died and his men were doomed, the Shieldings quickly claimed the field. And now here's a son of one or other of those same killers coming through our hall, overbearing us, mouthing boasts, and rigged in armor that by right is yours. And so he keeps on, recalling and accusing, working things up with bitter words until one of the lady's retainers lies spattered in blood, split open on his father's account. The killer knows the lie of the land and escapes with his life. Then on both sides the oath-bound lords will break the peace. A passionate hate will build up in Ingeld, and love for his bride will falter in him as the feud rankles. I just stopped off at line 2066, and I read a lot of this passage because this really gets us into the heart of how this poem holds up a mirror to the society that is on the one hand, admiring. I think Beowulf is somebody that generally we're intended to admire, but at the same time, he is the product of and the highest reflection of a culture that, glorifies violence and revenge. And there has to be some distance between the values and ethos of that culture and that of a Christian narrator reflecting on this legendary past. If this poem is written even in 1000, even if it's written in 700, which is one of the earliest dates proposed for us, it's still hundreds of years after the events that are described in it. But in any case, that revenge is one kind of reciprocity. They killed your dad, go kill them, and we talked about the Were-Guild before. But the other kind of reciprocity is, of course, the exchange of treasure. And Wealhtheow presented Beowulf with a torque, and he will give that to Hygelac bride. Hygd, Hygd. And this is just a picture of an actual Anglo-Saxon torque. In many ways, they had a pretty primitive culture if you look at their architecture and clothing, but they were very, very cunning metal workers. This great torque from Snettisham, Norfolk, is made of 8 ropes twisted together, each rope made of 8 strands of gold. This is just something to think about in terms of the material culture. One of the questions, of course, in your discussion is, what is the significance of objects in Beowulf, and how will that change after line 2200? And that is after we fast forward 50 years to Old King Beowulf, and we get at line 22.5 and following, there's some dots that are places where we can't even reconstruct what the manuscript might have said because it was too badly burned. This fire, of course, happened in the 17th century when the one manuscript holding Beowulf poem was almost destroyed in the fire of, I think, the Cotton Library. Despite the best efforts of philologists and textual critics to reconstruct what was said in this part, it is lost to us, which is especially a shame because this seems to be a crucial transitional part of the text where we find out what exactly happens that wakes up this dragon that's been sleeping under the ground for a really long time. This intruder sneaks in, steals a cup, and then runs off, and then the dragon comes out and gets really mad and starts running around doing everything. We do get this one strange passage called the Last Survivor's Speech. This is from line 2245 and following, where he talks about everything that once was there, which is now lost. It's a sort of a flashback to the last guy who had this treasure and put it in the ground because his entire clan, his entire race or tribe was gone. And he says the following words.
Your men, my lord, will follow you to whatever end. Where is the horn that was blowing? They have passed like rain on the mountains, like wind in the meadow. The days have gone down in the west, behind the hills, into shadow.
Okay, that's not exactly what he says, but it's relatively similar. So basically, I brought us up to just before the Beowulf goes up to fight the dragon. That's about all the time I'm probably going to have for recording today. Hopefully I can get some more up tomorrow on the Christian versus pagan stuff and on the dragon fight. Maybe I'll smooch those together. I'm not really sure. In any case, I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you've learned something. Keep watching. More importantly, keep reading.